The history of rigid airships is a story full of excitement and adventure. Man's struggle to conquer the air started with lighter-than-air craft, and a good deal of the basic knowledge which made the United States the leader in general aeronautics was gained by the pioneers of the airship. The rigid airship not only has its part in the history of aircraft, but can fulfill important functions in future military and commercial air transportation. The first thought in many minds when talking about rigid airships is the terrible accident of the Hindenburg. After a successful career as a passenger and cargo ship, the Hindenburg on May 6, 1937, caught fire at Lakehurst. Miraculously, most of those aboard the Hindenburg were saved. 62 out of 97 came out of that inferno alive. The cause of the fire has never been determined. The Board of Investigation reported,
"The theory that a brush discharge, St. Elmo's fire, ignited a mixture of hydrogen appears most probable."
Other well-qualified authorities feel that the fire was an act of sabotage. However, it must be kept in mind that the big flaw, and inevitably the fatal defect in the German scheme of things, was that these big ships had to be inflated with hydrogen, which is a highly inflammable gas. In any case, the disaster put an end for the time being to the commercial operation of rigid airships. Back in 1897, the inventor Schwartz created what was technically the world's first rigid airship. It was all aluminum, way ahead of its time. The real father of the rigid was Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a retired German Army officer. Zeppelin served as an observer with the Federal Balloon Company in the American Civil War. Based on his experiences with balloons, he later conceived the idea of the rigid airship. Several balloons, or gas cells, afforded a compartmentation scheme similar to that used in surface ships to localize loss of buoyancy in the event of damage. The structure to hold the balloons, then as now, consisted of a series of transverse frames, longitudinal girders, bracing wires, and gas cell wires. The first practical rigid, the LZ-1, flew for the first time on July 2nd, 1900. Vertical control was aided by a suspended sliding weight. A few early Zeppelins were operated from floating hangars, which automatically weather vaned. Thus, docking and undocking could always be carried out in the wind direction. But such maneuvers on water were not simple and gave way to improved methods and hangars on shore. Doors proved one of the toughest problems. Sticking out like huge ears, they disturbed normal airflow and sometimes set up dangerous eddies and gusts. The orange peel type was an improvement. The doors roll back against the main building. The telescopic door was even better. It was an engineering achievement to slide the giant panels one behind the other easily and quickly. These disappearing doors set up no turbulence. But in the early days, the answer was canvas or no doors at all. Gradually, Count Zeppelin gathered around him a number of talented co-workers, notably Dr. Hugo Echner, who became not only a famous airship skipper, but also the leader of German airship development. Dr. Ludwig Durr, designer responsible for many important Zeppelin engineering features. Dr. Carl Arnstein, who became an American citizen and has continued his airship work in the United States. And Captain Ernest Lehmann, Zeppelin raider in World War I and the first skipper of the Hindenburg. In 1910, Zeppelin founded the world's first regularly organized air transport concern, the German Airship Navigation Company, known as DELAG. The early passenger airships, Deutschland, Schwaben, Victoria Louise, and others, were equipped not only with promenade decks, but also restaurant and cabin facilities. Thousands of passengers were carried hundreds of thousands of miles with a perfect passenger safety record. The Zeppelin's only real rival was the Chute-Lance airship, cigar-shaped and with a framework of wood. 20 Chute-Lance ships were built, but with the outbreak of World War I, production was standardized on designs of the Zeppelin type and principles. The Germans had a powerful new weapon, the long-range Zeppelin, developed by their commercial airship company. The German Army made limited use of rigid airships, but the German Navy used them to a greater extent. One notable Zeppelin flight was a voyage of over 4,000 miles non-stop from Bulgaria to German East Africa and back, most of the trip over unfriendly territory, adding to the hazard. The use of the airship as a weapon caught the Allies unprepared. For the first time in history, it was possible to carry a large cargo of bombs hundreds of miles by air to enemy territory. As a countermeasure, the Allies were forced to use the airplane. But the tremendous advantage of the Zepp in range and carrying capacity continued to make them a constant threat. In a few raids over England, the Germans tried out an ingenious cloud car, or spy basket. This was a very good idea and extremely effective under the right conditions. The Zeppelin, hidden in the clouds, was reasonably safe from attack and discovery. There was opportunity for accurate observation, the observer telephoning his findings to the ship. The tactical value of the Zepp was proved in the Battle of Jutland, when information about the British fleet was radioed to the German Fleet Command. This is attested in an official British report.
It is no small achievement for their Zeppelins to have saved the German high seas fleet at the Battle of Jutland.
Planes, anti-aircraft, and especially means for setting their hydrogen afire finally stopped virtually all raids over England, but the scouting activities of the Zeppelins continued. During 4 years of war, the Germans made over 300 raids and 1,000 scouting missions. Summed up, 10% were bombing flights and 90% strictly naval sorties. They used 116 rigid airships during the war. About a third of these were lost due to pioneering defects or inexperience in handling. Allied guns and planes brought down another third. The remaining third were decommissioned intact. Surprisingly enough, only 441 German airship officers and men were lost in 4 years of war. The British started their wartime airship program late and could only attempt to copy the German design from meager information. However, the Allies later were lucky enough to bring down a couple of German war Zeppelins almost intact, and they studied these diligently. When the war ended, the Allies distributed amongst themselves the remaining German airships, giving them further material for study. As a result, in 1919, the British completed the R-34, a Zeppelin copy. Pleased and proud, they immediately flew her westward over the Atlantic. Her landing at Mineola, Long Island, marked the world's first non-stop transatlantic air crossing between England and the United States. The R-33, sister ship of the 34, was used mostly for experiments. She was the first rigid to carry an airplane from the ground and launch it in flight. An unpremeditated incident, a break from the mast in a high wind, proved she could take it. Broken nose and all, she came home safely. This proved the value of Zeppelin's compartmentation scheme. In 1921, the U.S. Navy purchased the R-38, or ZR-2, from the British. This ship was designed primarily for high-altitude use. However, during her builder's trials, she was admittedly maneuvered severely at low altitude. Under aerodynamic loads for which she was not intended, her structure failed. Her hydrogen burst into flames, and she became a total loss. At this point, the British decided to get away from Zeppelin copies. The R-100 and R-101, completed in the late 20s, were designed from scratch and intended for passenger service in the British Empire communication system. The R-100 made several successful flights through pretty rough weather, including a transatlantic round trip in August 1930 between England and Montreal. The R-101 was not so fortunate. No sooner was she built than it was decided to cut her in two and add an extra section to provide more lift. Before being adequately tested, she was rushed off on a demonstration trip to India. Faulty gas valves and a crude ballast system undoubtedly contributed to her getting out of control. She crashed into a hill in France, and hydrogen fire consumed her. Tragic testimony to too much haste. This ended British airship efforts.